We're all talking about intellectual property and economic growth. And there are a number of questions that need to be answered today. Can we really provide evidence on the direct link between development of intellectual property and economic development? Is intellectual property really the factor which drives development? We also need to look at the benefits of intellectual property, not only in terms of economic benefits, but other benefits which are more difficult to quantify. We often turn to creative industries because everybody wants to develop this positive agenda. But do we have enough evidence that makes the case for creative industries to be the development factor? We are also interested to know, isn't our approach to creative industries slightly exaggerated? Can they solve all of our problems? There seems to be sometimes a tendency to raise so high the level of expectations, so we need to back this up with empirical evidence. There are many other questions. Let me see how much I can answer of that. Now, okay. I'm trying to scroll the slides. It's not always. Yeah. Well, maybe you can help me to put up the right slide. In the meantime, I will go back to the statement which I made in my opening remarks that indeed intellectual property is only one of the factors to support creativity. Creativity has always existed in society, even in times when there was no intellectual property protection. But what has happened since the creation of this tool is that creators have available a new conceptual framework which can help them to transform much easier their creative outputs into economic goods and services. And it also helps us to actually monitor what are the demand and supply and what are the trends in that sector. Indeed, copyright in particular is one of the concepts which is most closely associated with the creative industries because it came about in order to protect and promote creativity. So what is protected under copyright falls under our understanding of creative industries. And as you will see from my next slide, indeed, the role of definitions is very important. We tend to speak of creative industries and sometimes we have a different understanding of what is included in this. Where does creativity stop and who decides that one activity is more creative than another one? And the definitions play an important role because they decide actually what is going to be the scope of the research that we are undertaking. And there seem to be two views out there. One is the broader approach. Creative economy, that's the economy of the future, everything which can be called creative. And as a result of this, you can have most incoherent elements put together in a definition. And very often these definitions are linked to policy agendas. Let's look at the Pirate Party agenda, which suggests that a world without copyright would be the world that creativity can flourish best. There are more narrow approaches, and usually those narrow approaches tend to take at the heart of the definition one important aspect. It could be culture, it could be intellectual property, innovation, and others. And then you have very clear criteria. How are those industries defined? It is very clearly linked to one policy area and usually linked to standardized statistical frameworks, so you have data on that. And in this debate, when we don't know countries speaking about creative industries, what do they mean exactly? What we know is that certainly we're moving towards a new definition of this phenomenon. And even though we might not have all the elements, we know that it's going to be a multidisciplinary definition. And one of the major denominators is that it is going to denominate innovative processes. And one thing which is very important is to keep in mind that we are not talking about a parallel economy. We are talking about something which already exists. We're just trying to describe it differently, but we're not talking about something which is totally unknown to us. So the role of copyright in the creative economy is first and foremost the role of an enabler because it provides you with this system of incentives and rewards And it provides you also with a business model which gives back the returns to the authors and creators. But in economic terms, the most important role of copyright is that it provides that framework for the operation of the market. So it tells you what is allowed to be done on this market. How can you trade your property there? What are the terms for doing this? And in that sense, we can use it as we can use copyright as a benchmark for economic analysis. We also have criteria for distinguish the scope of the creative industries that I will be discussing, namely those falling under copyright protection. Now, what can you measure? I can tell you that, as Einstein used to say, everything can be counted, but not everything counts. So, and we can certainly count everything. It's all a matter of cost, Vanus, right? So, you can try to measure economic performance. You can try to measure impacts, if you know exactly what are the two stages that you're comparing. You can try to measure size, or you can try to measure the contribution. And the lower the level of the analysis, the better information you can get. On micro levels, you can get the best information possible. However, when you move to the macro picture, some things become a little bit more difficult. In copyright terms, you can measure direct revenues of creators and creative industries, but that can be sometimes problematic. Or you can try to assess on a macroeconomic level what is happening. And creators do have various sources of income. On this slide, you can see just some of them. What you receive as a publisher, a royalty, as a newspaper journalist, salaries. You can receive a fee as a photographer, a license for the permission to use a work, or you can receive income from rights, let's say performing rights for licensed work. Your remuneration can be channeled to you through your collective management organization, or you may be receiving other revenues such as compensations for private copying. There are various income streams available to creators, but not all of those are immediately available in terms of statistics and cannot be put together. So what we go is we try to work from a macroeconomic perspective. I agree with John that indeed the GDP doesn't tell you everything, but it is, however, a category which is used by many countries and based on very standardized measurement frameworks. So we are producing these surveys which are essentially trying to raise the awareness of people and showing them what the trends are in those industries. We can compare also them with other sectors of the economy and with other countries. I'm happy to go into a discussion on what are the possible uses of these studies, perhaps at the end of the session in our debate. What are we looking at in terms of indicators? Yes, indeed, we're looking at value added as a percentage of the gross domestic product. We're looking at employment, and we're looking at foreign trade to the extent possible. This is the standard set of indicators. Everybody produces data on that. But in the course of the application of these guidelines that we developed some 12 years ago, we have seen also different indicators coming up from the studies, much more dynamic indicators, such as what are the productivity levels in those industries? What are the multiplier effects? What are the multipliers there? What is the contribution to the real GDP growth? How much actually comes from the creative sector? And I think that the search for the best indicators will continue. On this slide, which might be a bit difficult for you to read because we have already 42 countries that have completed their surveys. Some of them have done it more than once. And the average stands, as of today, at 5.18. That's the contribution of those 42 countries in terms of their copyright industries to the GDP. And on top of the list, you have some developed countries, the United States, then you have also Korea, you have St. Lucia comes up very high on that list. And down the bottom of the list, we have developing countries like Peru, Brunei, and others. But if you look at the employment contribution, you will see completely different countries topping the chart. And here we have, as the highest, the Philippines and Mexico, countries where employment stands for more than 11% of the employed people in the country. So you can understand that that becomes a very, very important social indicator. Governments fall on bad employment data. They don't always fall on bad GDP data, but employments bring governments down, so they tend to focus much more on that. So you have also some interesting countries here in this slide on the top range, such as Bhutan, for example, a very small country, seems to have a lot of people employed there. And on down the list, we have Ukraine, Thailand, and Malawi. The average stands at 5.3 today from these 42 countries. What is the labor productivity in terms of the labor productivity index, which we developed? That labor productivity index basically is telling you how much labor inputs do you need to produce 1 unit of output. And on top of that list, as per the study completed with the assistance of my friend Professor James, who is going to speak later, you'll see that on top of the list there are quite a number of countries from your region: St. Kitts, Panama, St. Lucia, Kenya, Jamaica. There you seem to have a lot of competitive advantage in terms of the amount of labor that you put into producing creative units. And Mexico and the Philippines are the last countries on the list where a lot of employment takes place, but unfortunately very little value stays in those countries. So as a result, that index is giving you an idea which may be somewhat different from what you expected. We can map out those contributions on that scheme, and that allows us actually to see how countries are moving with the time and where do they stand on that plot, whether they have a good combination of value creation and jobs, which would characterize their creative industries as more and more efficient. Now, let's look at how this data that we have from 42 countries compares with other economic data. And I've taken as a first example the GDP per capita in terms of purchasing power. And we're trying to establish to see whether there is any relationship between the contribution of the creative sector to the GDP and the GDP per capita of the different countries. And what you can see here is that there is a positive relationship between these two variables, which means that if you increase one of them, the other one will also increase. So countries that seem to have a well-performing creative sector also tend to have a higher GDP per capita. Let's look at another category which I'm sure Mr. Fox will be very interested in, and that's the FDI inflow, the foreign direct investment. We're all fighting to get more of that. And as you can see, the relationship here is even stronger. In other words, countries that have well-performing creative sectors seem to be attracting more and more foreign direct investment. We've looked at many other correlations, which I will not show because we don't have all the time. But on that little chart, you can see that in terms of importance of these factors, on top comes the foreign direct investment, followed by the Global Innovation Index. That is something which is prepared by WIPO, which is telling you about the innovative capacity in a country. The third comes the GDP per capita. Fourth comes the Global Competitiveness Index. That is the index prepared by the World Economic Forum. So countries that are doing well in their creative sector seem to be more competitive. Then comes the index of business freedom, how easy it is to do business. And there seems to be again a positive relationship with the GDP contribution of the creative sector. Finally, freedom from corruption, also an interesting indicator, also a positive relationship between the two. Now let's look at some of the World Bank worldwide governance indicators and see if there's any relationship between them and the performance of the creative sector. First one would be government effectiveness. Well, you do have, again, a positive relationship. Second one, we're looking at political stability, less so, but still it is a positive one. Rule of law, strong relationship with the creative sector performance. Voice and accountability, the same. So you see everywhere where the creative sector is performing well, it seems to be in direct relationship and a positive relationship with all the important governance indicators. What about employment? Well, if we look at the employment levels, again, most of the relationships are positive, a little lower numbers, so to a lower extent, the employment in the creative sector seems to be linked to the global innovation, competitiveness, and GDP per capita. However, this is also a positive relationship. Very clearly, it's negatively related to inflation and unemployment. So when the sector performs well, of course, those values of inflation and unemployment would be moving down. So let's look at the creative industries by sector and what do our studies on a global level show. The core copyright industries or the core creative sector, we consider the sector comprising those industries that cannot operate without copyright protection. Within those 9 industries, by far the biggest industry is the publishing industry. These are the authors, the journalists, the newspapers, all of that, which stands for 36% of the GDP which is created in the core group. It's followed by such industries as software, and then you have the film, then you have the music, advertising. So these are the top 5. Looking at employment, even higher amount of people are employed in the publishing. It's close to 40%. And the remaining 5 industries are pretty much the same as with GDP. In the same order, you have software, you have radio and television, you have film, music, and advertising. And advertising by far is the fastest growing of these 9 industries. I'm not going into detail because we are supposed to have a discussion, Mr. Chairman, with the panel, and there may be an opportunity to expand a little bit more on the figures there. There is a slide I like very much, which we call the creative DNA. It resembles a little bit a DNA sample. But what it tells you actually is what is the composition of the creative industries in terms of the core industries in selected countries. And the idea that you can get from this slide is that we are all different. There are no 2 countries which have similar creative sector, because this is our national identity and this is our creative DNA. In terms of how do these industries compare with the rest of the economy, this is again just an example based on some countries, which is suggesting that these industries with this 5.18% of the GDP are actually bigger than many of the traditional sectors, which comes as a surprise. They are bigger than agriculture in many countries. They are bigger than tourism and restaurants in countries which are typically considered tourism sites and tourism destinations. For each country it's different, but indeed it is a sizable sector. 5% is not negligible by any government whatsoever. Now, in our model, we differentiate several levels of dependence of the industries on copyright. I mentioned core industries, like the industries which cannot exist and function without copyright protection. But we look also at non-core groups following the value chain in those industries. In other words, second group is facilitating industries, those that could exist without copyright, but they wouldn't make much sense because they produce important products and services which are necessary for the functioning of the core group. For example, production of cinematographic equipment, production of musical instruments, all those things that could exist on the side, but they are essential for the production of the core products and services of the core group. Thirdly, then we have industries where copyright stands only for a portion of the activities. These are the partial industries. And finally, those dealing with distribution, which we call non-dedicated. What I'm showing on this slide is how much is produced in the different groups of industry, in the different groups of countries. And the idea of this slide is the following. You can see that the developed world is producing most of the creative jobs and value in the core industries. But for the developing world, most of the contribution actually comes from the non-core group, where copyright plays only a partial role, or where you have facilitating industries or distribution industries. This is very, very important, because had we gone for an approach that just advocates for a selected group of industries, 9, 11, 13, 15, then we probably would have ended only with half of the story. Since we followed the value chain, we were able to see what were all the multiple effects that were produced by copyright in economic terms. And they seem to make the case that indeed it is important for developing countries, and a lot is being produced in sectors which would have been neglected in a standard study. Now, I think that I've come to my final words, Mr. Moderator. Yes, of course, I already spoke of some of the findings. Indeed, these industries are really well connected with the rest of the economy. In times of economic difficulties, you see that some of them also shrink, but others are helping actually the country to come out of the recession. We've seen them with very impressive dynamics. Recent reports from the US, from Europe suggest that at least twice higher rate of growth in those industries as compared to the average of the economy. And indeed, output and employment multipliers in the core group are impressive. So, to finish up, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Moderator, I think that if we want to make the case that creative industries are important for development, we have to prove it, we have to produce empirical evidence, and that's the only thing which can actually influence the debate. I think that from the relationships we looked at, it is very clear that creative industries flourish when you have the right legal environment, when you have the right business environment, and when they are supported by government policies. So if we want to make the case for the creative industries, we need to work on the evidence, and we are very happy to assist you in doing that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gantchev, for that international perspective, and I'm sure that much of the information you provided will stimulate thought and perhaps some questions when we get to that section of the program. I'd now like to introduce our next speaker, Professor Vanus James, Senior Fellow, Scotiabank Chair, and Adjunct Distinguished Professor of Economics, University of Technology, Jamaica. Dr. James is an economist who regularly undertakes a variety of assignments for the United Nations family of organizations. He has published in refereed international and regional professional journals and books. Currently, his main line of research explores the role of import productivity and democracy in the competitiveness and profitability of industries and economies, hence in economic development. Dr. James is a WIPO international consultant measuring contribution of copyright to Caribbean economies. Estimates have already been done for Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, and the OECS. And I really would like to just highlight his fundamental work, the economic contribution of copyright-based industries in Jamaica, which really is a benchmark and the most substantive single work that has been done for us in this area. He's also a member of the UN Economic and Social Council expert group, now considering how best to upgrade monitoring of the progress countries are making in achieving the Millennium Development Goals. Dr. James has lectured in several universities in the United States and the Caribbean, and is currently attached to the University of Technology, Jamaica as the senior research fellow in the Scotiabank Chair of Entrepreneurship and Development, and 2, the Adjunct Distinguished Professor of Economics and Econometrics. He previously served as Senior Policy Advisor to the UNDP. Please welcome Dr. James.
I think, good afternoon to all. Richard forgot my languages. So I speak Tobagonian, Trinidadian, Jamaican, Belizean, Bajan, St. Lucia. I stopped the counting. See that, Dimiter? And no English. Let's begin by seeing where we came from with all this work. We really started with Carol Coy and Lorna Reed, to whom WIPO gave the first assignment, and when they were too busy with being the best statisticians in the region, they turned it over to me and asked if I could help. And in that context, I'd like to take the opportunity to congratulate Carol for becoming not only our best statistician, but the head of the best statistical institution in the Caribbean. Starting. What's our goal? We wanted to measure the contribution of copyright-based industries to the Caribbean economy. And what we tended to do was to follow the WIPO method as set out in the famous WIPO guide. That is in itself quite a controversial kind of document, challenged by everybody. We did our own thing too, but the guide gave us the broad parameters within which we worked. The WIPO's groups of industries that Dimiter mentioned, the core and the interdependent, all shaped around their relative dependence on copyright for the generation of value added. The notion of a copyright sector is really the same as the notion of a satellite sector in the system of national accounts. And what we're trying to do is compile from a variety of places where we would find, in different industries, where we would find activities that rely on copyright or generate copyright or help with the generation of copyright as such. We try to compile the sum of all of these outputs and all of the contributions those activities make to employment and to trade. We've done that for a reason. In the largest scheme of things, in the global setting, we know that these are big drivers of poverty reduction and, critically, huge contributors to the generation of equity if we get the sectors right as policymakers. Now, poverty reduction has been a big part of the global development agenda for a long time. And we've always known that the challenge was to get the sectors right. And I think heading in the direction of the copyright industries is about that. We've looked traditionally in the Caribbean and in the world to the manufacturing sector to spur growth, employment, and trade. And this was largely about structural interdependence and the role of patents, especially as intellectual property in that process. We were concerned with structural interdependence along with the concern with the extent to which a country was bringing its total output close enough to its potential. And in a sense, development was about achieving as close a tie between those two things as possible, the famous output gap. We wanted to narrow that as much as possible. But even in that setting of the 50s and 60s and 70s, when this was the heart of the story, there was an economist that we all know about in the Caribbean called Lloyd Best, who kept arguing that the secret to the whole thing was to look to yourself, think independently, and create industries out of your independent thought. Copyright proves him to be right. And what is more about this copyright industry business, as you've seen with music and all of those things, is that the threshold for investment for many, many of its activities is very low. And because it's very low, poor people could come in. The secret to Marley and others, not necessarily to Chris Blackwell, but you couldn't get Chris Blackwell without Marley and Tosh, and them grow up like poor people. Them grow up as poor people. So that's the story. Calypso, reggae, spooge, wherever you look in the Caribbean on the musical side, but the carnival industries. All of the things we do with the works of mass in the Caribbean are all driven from below, as it were. We went to our favelas and in Brazil, in our ghettos, and we found who we were, fighting a world we didn't want. And we invented a successful industry, almost all on our own, without the help of our governments, for the most part. Now, they came in, and they did strategic things. But this business of, I've seen a lot of reports arguing that these are industries that the governments keep afloat and all that nonsense. Let me tell you that the data shows that these are private-driven industries, most of the output as private activity. Government contributes a very tiny share, even when they make significant inputs like in Trinidad and Tobago. I mean, 50, 60 million is the big quarrel in Trinidad and Tobago today. In an industry that is easily 8, 9, 7, $6 billion if counted properly. So don't overplay this business about government being the heart of the story. Anyway, nowadays, what we're doing is we are looking increasingly to the service sector for productivity growth and expanded trade. And in that context, the thing is that we understand we are doing that but to extract gains in the form of productivity arising from goodwill, what the accountants call goodwill, rather than anything else. That's the heart of the productivity story. And here the copyright sector and what we call structural capital in accounting come into their own. If you think about it, think about how the musical bands work, think about how the steel bands work, or the mass camps work in Trinidad and Tobago and so on. And what you'll notice is that in those industries, we succeed in creating an environment in which people want to work. Don't compare that with the public sector. That's, if you go to a mass camp, work is enthusiastic. But it's the same when Marley and Tosh and them were practicing. They work whole night, they invent ideas, they innovate, and they turn that into what we call copyright. That's the secret of these industries. They wake us up, they make us feel confident about ourselves, they solve all our self-esteem problems and so on. They generate talent that the world discovers while we try to make money. They make sweeter music than Beethoven. These are just amazing industries. They provide relational capital. We can count. I mean, talk about networking. These are the industries. Everything you need to build a society, you can find in our copyright sectors. So what we've discovered by studying them carefully and treating them as industry rather than as cultural events is that they really come into their own, not only as producers of copyright, but as producers of goodwill, the key to productivity and profitability when all is said and done. Encased in them would be huge amounts of tacit knowledge, mechanisms of democracy. I would declare here that the most democratic institution in Trinidad and Tobago, and maybe the whole Caribbean, is the National Carnival Council of Commission of Trinidad and Tobago, where the stakeholders drive policy. I mean, from below. They dictate to the chair, they dictate to the CEO, and it's not the CEO who dictates to them. And we just had a quarrel over the routes in Trinidad and Tobago for the mass. And it was the institutions that forced the NCC and the government to back down, even in the face of something that the engineers said was wrong. The engineers said go clockwise or anti-clockwise. The band say you can't go anti-clockwise, you'll go against the wind. Practical experience and all that. But they forced the government to change its mind. And that's the kind of democracy. So the secret to our development, the secret to our democracy. The big challenge in the Caribbean, really, in that context, is to get the data to prove these claims to be true. And we thank WIPO for getting us started in that process, providing some money and so on. WIPO's program is essentially a hugely underfunded program. I can speak from experience when I tell you, pretty much I have done 3 studies and I've made no money. It's all goodwill. Because WIPO would give you $30,000 or $40,000 or so, $20,000 in the case of Jamaica. And of course you share it among everybody involved. You give Statin some, you give this some, and so on. By the time you're done, you say, all right, I hope I can make something by going back to my old friends in the UNDP to make a living, because the WIPO thing can't pay. That's the experience. They asked us to talk about the experience. But what am I getting at? Not WIPO has done extremely well just to take small amounts of funds and win the will from the rest of us to do the work. What I'm getting at is we need adequate data to make this case, and in particular to make policy for the industry. We need properly managed, sufficiently large, random samples to estimate properly the share of copyright in the GDP, in employment, and in trade. And most of the work done with these shoestring budgets must now, in my view, be turned over to the national statistical organizations. For something like copyright, embedded in all sorts of little sectors all over the economy, we need enormous granularity, a lot of detail, coverage of a lot of detail, many, many more cases than we get to see in the ordinary national accounting. Something more like what you want to do if you want to do a supply and use table or something like that. You need a lot of activities to be covered, 100 plus maybe, starting those because they have pretty much the best in the region and stuff like that. You need to cover all the products. We haven't gotten even to much of that in terms of what are the outputs, the products of these activities. They're not simple like music. If you take something like a steel band in Trinidad and Tobago, they do music, of course. But they do welding, they repair cars, all because they have to make racks and stands on which to move their pans. They develop byproducts and sell car repair services in the steel yards. That kind of thing requires more granularity, more detail than the WIPO budget can cover. So while we thank WIPO, I think you are looking more in the direction of $250,000–300,000 US a year to be turned over to Statin to measure music properly here. And similar figures in Trinidad and Tobago and perhaps in the same zone for Barbados and so on. So that kind of lack of budgeting speaks to the fact that we've got to confront our own lack of will to know ourselves properly, change, and not rely all the time going forward on what WIPO and UNCTAD and so on can raise, small amounts. The aspect of the estimation that suffered most in our work through the years is trade. We measured decently because we got access to Carol's data in the first estimates. She was breaking almost all the conventional rules, which is why I call her the best statistician, to make all the data available. And she would help in the best possible way, give you things you would normally want. CSO in Trinidad and Tobago did the same thing. Fantastic work over there in St. Lucia. Same approach. These are statisticians of the finest quality across the region. But they couldn't give adequate data on trade, and we couldn't get much from the central banks. Caribbean countries, however, depend heavily on trade. So it makes no sense for us to be able to measure value added and employment and not know how we are fitting into the global scheme. We've got to be able to measure ourselves against the world and understand how we're penetrating markets. That's the biggest story in our survival. How we make the world love our things. When you buy, the world makes you love its things. You survive by making the world love your things. You've got to monitor that. So for trade to be the part that suffers the most is nothing short of, let me use strong language and say disgraceful for the studies themselves and for us as a people. And I want to emphasize, no one, including the central banks, could provide the data. Regarding the employment and output, Jamaica, to tell you the story, had very little money to go beyond the 20,000 that WIPO could fund, even though Statin partnered so closely and contributed from its own value, personal, and other such value. And it did its best to share what little data it had and to get us the starting approximations and so on. But we had to work with very strong, very crude assumptions. And the essence of these assumptions is the so-called copyright factors, for which, if you want to get those right, you've got to have surveys. And we couldn't do that. So many of the factors in the case of Jamaica came from comparisons with Mexico and the US. And these are not exactly Jamaican-type economies, but those are what were available at the time. And certainly they are our nearest neighbor, so there's something there. And so we could see what we could get. How much time again? You gone? Okay. Perfect. It would help if we could do a full copyright survey here in Jamaica to build estimates in the future. But to do that, we would need other international partners, and more, other than WIPO, and we would need something more in the way of what we did when we were doing the survey of living conditions. A partnership in the local community, partnering with the international community, lifting the standards of the work, building the Statistical Institute at the same time, and producing a world-class body of work that even WIPO would come to praise, as the World Bank praised our work in the SLC to this, and has been praising it to this day. That's the kind of thing we should do in the Caribbean. We did it for music, we could do it for statistics too. And I would like to see it done here in Jamaica first. Only I have a little surprise for you. They're coming at you in Trinidad, and I will tell you that. Trinidad and Tobago put up the resources for their study. They had the money, they put up all the resources. So that proves that when we have to do what we have to do, we as a people in the region, we do it. In this case, however, the CSO lacked the technical capacity, both in terms of interviewer, staff. You know, Statin maintains a pretty professional interviewer staff. Trinidad and Tobago doesn't do that. And the processing skill to deliver on the time scale. They could, if you give them time, they could do the work. But government wanted the answer in 3 to 6 months. It takes magic, and if you're going to do that, you have to scale up in quality and staffing. They didn't have that in place. So a lot of the work, a lot of the surveys were done. We spent a lot of money on it, but we didn't have the capability to process all of it in the way it should be. And that points to another set of needs. That's my point about putting your house in order if you want to rely on these industries to drive your growth. And they do offer the potential. As we pointed out in the Trinidad and Tobago report, the estimates might change significantly when we are finished with the processing of the data and we get the copyright factors right. St. Lucia led the OECS work in the sense that it had everything in place. St. Lucia is the premier institution in that region. It had everything in place, but it only had enough money that we managed to raise from WIPO to do a survey among the unincorporated enterprises. The people who operate from home and sing and go around the savannah when the carnival come and sell food and so on, part of the story. They couldn't cover the larger firms, which do have a lot of copyright in what they're doing. These gave us reasonable factors, but what we did was to adjust them for plausibility by using geometric means, combining with the studies in Brunei and the Philippines. Now, all that is fine because of the WIPO methodology. We were able to do that. We used the resulting factors for the OECS study and for the Trinidad and Tobago study. But you could see what you're getting at here. What you're getting at is the need to put enough resources into getting the factors right so that you take out any haziness from the estimates, just as when Statin measures agriculture and measures manufacturing and could say within a reasonable degree of certainty, these are the estimates to go with. We have to clean up our factors, and that requires survey work. Now, none of that speaks to the critical need. Speaking as a Caribbean person here, not just as a Jamaican, none of all this speaks to the critical need for data to shape industrial policy. The studies as we've done them so far really can't be used to shape industrial policy in the way we need to. You get sensible guidelines from them, and we've shared all that we could extract based on all the things we've been doing. But to get industrial policy right, policy for the industry, policy for the firms, policy for related sectors, allocation of budgets and so on, you need something different. You need to get, and let me say, what Caribbean people, from Jamaica to the bottom end of Trinidad and Tobago, what we want all over the region is sound policy. The people are very clear. We want public policies to encourage the development and growth of these industries. When you go around and you do the special surveys, which we did in every case, we went to experts, we went to interested parties, and we talked to people. Number one, people say policies are simply not right. Let's get those right. Well, what they want to do is improve the businesses, the establishments, they want to improve the sector, and they want to improve national competitiveness and so on. What we know is that we came up short when it came to manufacturing. Right? We didn't come up short with copyright from the actual practice. So why don't we get the copyright policies right? Well, we need to get enough data to do so. We win with copyright. Now we need to throw the kitchen sink at the world. But to do that, we've got to get the policies right. And so what that means is quite specific. Let me also give you another aside. In the case of Trinidad and Tobago, where, like in Barbados, you have quite a bit of Dutch disease, as we call it, the copyright sector still thrived. In the case of a fairly rapidly sliding exchange rate here, it still thrived. So if we do the policies right, if we get the data right and we set up the policies right, we're going to do what Jamaicans call gone clear. Much of the measures we have provided are too imprecise and too vague for the policies. So what do we have to know? We have to know something else. First, we need to know what is let's say the extent of inefficiency that we find inside the businesses that are involved. Even though they're doing their work, and they're innovating and so on, they could still be inefficient. To what extent are they? Find out why they are inefficient and fix them. Provide policies to suit. The same for the sectors in which they operate. They will drive sectors to do better and better because copyright is embedded in all different industries. But we've got to get a measure of the impact of the copyright within the sectors in which they operate to see how fast the growth of the copyright activity could improve the sector's efficiency and drive its actual output closer to its potential. And the same for the national economy. And it is that body of data that we can't get right in order to do the policy design because we don't have adequate surveys. So like when we were doing the living standards work and doing poverty policy, we extracted the poverty policy from data collected at the household level. It's pretty much the same technique that we use when we're doing sound industrial policy, and we really can't make sound industrial policy until we get the survey data up and running. Yet we know something. We know, for example, that the copyright sector, like say in Trinidad and Tobago and to a large extent in Jamaica and the Eastern Caribbean, 3-4 times larger than agriculture. We have a ministry for agriculture. We don't have no ministry. Well, it's all transparent. 5 more minutes. I'm finishing before that. We have no ministry for, I mean, culture is culture. We're talking industry here. We have no ministry for it as industry. That's the trick. Agriculture is called agriculture, but we treat it as industry. So you could call music culture if you want, but if you want to make money, you've got to treat it as absolutely. And that means you need to set up specialized facilities to support it. But you can't make all of that kind of case unless you have the granularity we need at the level of the data. So here's my summary thrust. The WIPO strategy has been good to help us to understand that we're looking at something that is nearly 3 times larger than the hotels and guest houses sector of the economy. It's measured directly by Statin, measured directly by hotels and guest houses and so on. And what we get from copyright drives you to somewhere in the region of 3 times as large as hotels and guest houses combined. Right? Now, that's not all of tourism in the satellite accounting sense, so I don't want to make that comparison, but I'm just talking about hotels and guest houses. So it's a big thing. And we have a tourism industry, we have ministry for that, specialized and so on. So you can see where I go with that story there. This is something nearly a quarter of manufacturing, as measured in the case of Trinidad and Tobago. And manufacturing is, what, 8 billion? You're looking at something, well, actually not about half, because you're looking at something in the current environment of about $4 billion in the case of Trinidad and Tobago. So this is a big industry. And it's grown faster than pretty much everything else in the region. In the Trinidad and Tobago data, for example, it grew by 11.7% between 2000 and 2007. And when the downturn came and everybody else was declining, it still grew by 3.2% between 2007 and 2011. Now, what are you talking about here? You're talking about an industry that discovered how to use goodwill, which is to say, innovation, copyright, industrial designs, geographical indications. I mean, mankind come to Jamaica to Sunsplash, in Negril. You come in, I remember asking a German tourist, boy, what you doing in a place like this with all this crime? He said, I come for the crime. That's the point. They come to Jamaica for whatever Jamaica, I mean. And this is a real story I'm talking about. These were the days when I was doing the study here. Right? So we also picked up the trend, decline in press and literature. We found that there was a decline in, publishing newspapers and so on. But what replaced it? We picked up the replacement, the displacement in the form of radio, right? Talk radio exploded in Jamaica at the time, exploded in Trinidad and Tobago at the time and so on. We found that, and the online streaming has made that even stronger compared to press. Press, of course, is catching up again now with online publications. So we're picking up all those trends. So the point is, we know where we're going, we know what we're doing, we need more precise measures to make policies to put a good curtail on the world. We can't afford to know we're making progress in the broad, vague sense anymore. The WIPO story has taken us as far as it can. Its real value, in my view, is that it has indicated that something serious is happening in the Caribbean, even if we don't know as precisely as we want to what is happening. And as I argued before, it's no longer useful to ask a consultant to do a little thing with 20,000 and 40,000 US dollars. That's not in our national interest anymore. Now, the national statistical organizations must take over the measurement process, bring the full weight of the kinds of skills that Carol brings to the table to bear on, and the SNA methods to boot, to bear on the measurement, upgrading every year, bringing out the figures every year in exactly the same way we do for manufacturing and agriculture. If we're making less money in agriculture and we're bringing out figures every year and can't do nothing much with it in agriculture, why don't we go ahead and do it for our musicians and so on, and at least do some, we're already doing something to win with that. So we need something. I want to recommend here to the whole Caribbean that we need something along the lines of the Jamaican project, SLC project each year for the next 20 years and then on to eternity. Because as I think someone said, we're measuring ourselves, we're discovering and knowing ourselves. What's the greatest secret of development? Man, know thyself, or woman, know yourself. Man and woman, know thyself. That's the secret. That's the end of my 5 minutes, but I want to tell you the Trinidad and Tobago story before I go. 2 seconds. If we put the money up, we are likely to find, from all indications, sectors that are producing and using copyright to generate so much goodwill as to be among the most productive and internationally competitive activities in our economies. These sectors are game changers that offer comparatively greater prospects of pushing firms to their potential, sectors to their efficiency frontiers, and pushing the economy to our fullest development potential. That was the promise best made. This is precisely, I think, what the government of Trinidad and Tobago and the National Carnival Commission have now initiated for the carnival sector. They came to me and they asked for help after we published the WIPO study. So much thanks to WIPO. After we published the WIPO study, the government came and said, we would like you to measure carnival itself. So I seized the opportunity. I said, no, that is not the approach. The way we should do it is bring everybody together one time. Set it up in the famous sector-wide methodology that the UN has been pushing for so long. Transparent policy design from below. Take account of the fact that the NCC is democratic in its design, and let's go. And the government, to its great credit, said yes. So what did we then do? We then began to recruit, just as we did for the SLC. That's what I'm telling you. We recruited the best engineers, best musicians we could find. We found lawyers, all the data domains, and all the stakeholder groups. Brought them together, and we're now working with them to shape the kind of health experts, to shape the kinds of policies we need, bringing the interface between science and policy right to the fore. That's exactly what Jamaica did when it brought the poverty rate down from 40-something% to 9%. It's drifting back up for whatever reasons I haven't been able to study. That's what we did. And that's what we should do for music, for copyright, and for all these kinds of industries. The interface of science and democratized policy will be strengthened in the case of Trinidad and Tobago as the basis for sustainable poverty reduction, equity, and development. That was the commitment of the country in Rio +20. Jamaica made that same commitment, and you should keep it with this industry as the leading edge. Way to go. Not you, way to go, Kamala. Kamala, the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago. To the future we all want and can create. Amen.
Thank you very much, Professor James, for your very informed and passionate presentation. And I think whatever language you are speaking, we got the message. Okay, and you did highlight the importance of data. And so in planning and policy making for these industries. And so it's very fortunate that our next presenter, Ms. Carol Coy, is the Director General of the Statistical Institute of Jamaica, who was appointed to this post in April 2013. Previously, she was the Deputy Director General with responsibility for the technical divisions of the Institute. She also held the position of Director of Economic Accounting Division for 13 years. During this tenure, she had overall responsibility for the development and maintenance of national accounts estimates on the Jamaican economy. This included conversion to the 1993 system of national accounts and the development of supply and use tables, input-output tables, and tourism satellite accounts for the Jamaican economy. Ms. Coy has participated in numerous specialized training courses in national accounts and the preparation of tourism satellite accounts and trade in services statistics. She is currently a member of the United Nations Statistics Division's Advisory Expert Group on National Accounts. Please welcome Ms. Coy.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Lumsden. Okay, my discussion will be looking at the perspective of Statin, the local NSO, and some of the issues we have in measuring, in providing information on the creative industries. Okay. As Dimiter said, the question is, are the creative industries critical to economic growth? And to be able to answer this, we must have empirical data. Reliable data is critical if you are going to assess the importance and growth of any industry. And as one person said, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. Government needs information in order to assess the success of its economic and social policies and to make changes where necessary. Information on which sectors can drive the growth of a country or on which sectors might need support is critical for development. One thing I want to point out is that given the competing demands on government resources, lobbying to government must be based on facts. And one of the realities the creative industry has to recognize is that all other industries are also lobbying government to develop policies. And if you are going to do the same, we have to provide that information for government. Working with international bodies, you're not taking gut feeling. There has to be empirical evidence. And any effective policy prescription for the industry must be information driven. The creative industries, we agree, they are important for the Jamaican economy in terms of value added generated, their share in employment, their contribution to foreign trade. However, and I think is a reality, and Dr. James mentioned the thing of we can produce information on agriculture every year, but we can't do it for the creative industries. One of the things we have to bear in mind, and I'm sort of going to put it to a different perspective, in these industries, persons are willing to provide the information. So if you go to a farmer, he's willing to tell you his sales, he's willing to tell you what's the cost of production. The provision of data doesn't come from modeling you do some assumption. For you to provide the data, there has to be data coming from the industry itself. And this is one of the weaknesses that we have with the creative industries. Okay? And so therefore, one of the issues is that this industry tend to, especially there are some segments of the industry that it's highly informal. And capturing data for these segments, it's very challenging for statisticians. We have tried at Statin, and I can tell you we have tried over the years. The data collection activities include collecting data. You have to generate contribution to the economy, as what has been mentioned. You have to look at its output. You have to look at its GDP. And a critical point, which I think the creative industry needs to understand, you also contribute to the investment in Jamaica. Because when intellectual property in the system of national accounts is considered as investment, and so at Statin, we do an estimation for this. But when you have weak data sources, what it means is that the numbers that you are going to put in Jamaica's total investment pool for that year from the creative industry maybe will not be reflecting in reality what it should be. We need to know who are the players in the industry. And this is another issue that we also face. Who are the players in the different segments of the industry? I presume the associations can help. But sometimes when we approach the associations, the amount of information that they have is very limited. And until the industry itself can provide some of this information, you're always going to be at a disadvantage to those industries that are, provide the information more willing. Okay? Exports. one of the things that will give any government any impetus to assist in policy for an industry is the earning of foreign exchange. Exports of services is now a critical part in the, for example, in the Jamaican economy. The hoteliers have a hand up on you because every year they can see how much is it that the hotel industry or the tourism industry earn from exports. It is very difficult for us to estimate what is the export, especially from the music industry. We have all this thing in our head. We are earning so much from exports. But can you get that information? Because everybody, there's this culture, as I'll go on to say, there's this culture of secrecy in Jamaica, and nobody wants to provide that information. So the current situation is that WIPO has provided assistance, as Dr. James mentioned, to a number of countries to undertake studies in the creative industry. I think the Jamaican one was done in 2005, and as he mentioned, Statin assisted, okay? However, to develop policy and to do an assessment of the industry, you require consistent provision of reliable information. And as he said again, every year we have information on agriculture, every year we have information on tourism. The methodology also has to be consistent with that recommended by international statistics. So it has to fit in with the methodologies that we use to estimate other industries in the Jamaican economy. The services industry in Jamaica are now the largest contributor to the Jamaican economy. Approximately 75% of the total value added of Jamaica is from services. It's also the industry that is growing the fastest compared to the goods producing. So the Jamaican economy is actually shifting from a goods producing to a services oriented industry. And most creative, apart from, I think, the printing and press, most creative industries are part of the services industries. In Jamaica, our industries are classified based on the Jamaica Industrial Classification. It's activity-based. The classification does not have a group called creative industries, but we can go within in our classification system, and it allows us to do detailed estimation of the creative industry. So there's not a barrier for us if at Statin, if we have the wherewithal, if we have the information to do this data. What we do currently, because we have the problem of getting information from the players in the industry, our indicators are mainly from what we call the demand side. So if we go to the musicians, they're not going to tell us. I can tell you that. What is their revenue? What are some of the costs? Because there's this fear that it's going to be for tax purposes. And I can tell you from now, the Statistics Act prevents Statin from providing any data, whether it's to the Ministry of Finance, whether it's to the Prime Minister. We cannot, under the Statistics Act, you could carry us to court if we were to provide any information that would allow government to be able to, anyone at all, to be able to can say who this company is. And this is one of the issues that Dr. James had with us, because we could not provide him with information at maybe that detail level that he needed, because under our act, it is illegal to provide any information other than for statistical purposes. Okay. So what we have had to do is to utilize data from the use. So for example, from our household surveys or from our business surveys, what we would get from them is how much of these industries or products are you using? And that is the route we have to go, because the players in the market refuse to provide. It's mainly small, because there are some, like, for example, the radio and television, press. We'll get information from those players who are businesses. Where we find, where it's critical to judge your importance, is from the small players in the industry. And so because of this, we cannot provide that disaggregated level of information that will give you the information so you could assess the progress of the industry. So for example, what we do at Statin, we have this large group which we call other entertainment activities, including nightclubs. And because of the methodology, this is how we have to estimate it. Included in that is songwriters and composers, live theatrical presentations, artists, independent actors, related activities such as lighting and sound, nightclubs. So what we could do at Statin is provide you estimation of other entertainment. We would not be able to provide you with information on songwriters and composers or painters. So, and this is some of the issues we have, okay? So our core copyright industries, basically, I think it was mentioned already, press, literature, musical, theatrical, motion picture, radio and television, photography, software, advertising services. When we look at a crude estimation, we are coming out with about 2.1% of total value added. And we know that this is underestimated, and we are only looking here at core. What is the way forward? The way forward is that Statin will have to partner with the creative industries in order to provide the type of data needed. And so where we have this secrecy and the fact of not providing that information. So even if we were to go the route of Trinidad and go to a household survey, we would have to still get that information for you. So even if WIPO or the government provides that data, the players in the market have to take some responsibility in providing that information, because nobody's going to know how the industry is performing unless you tell them what is happening in that industry. But there are some good news. The Statin works with CARICOM, and as part of its work program, the creative industry, CARICOM sees the creative industry as one area in which statistical agencies in the region need to work to collect information to assist in policy. So that is my short plea.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Coy, for clarifying some of the statistical issues involved in gathering and providing data on this, these very important industries. We're going to move right into the next presentation and introduce Professor Carolyn Cooper from the Department of Literatures in English, University of the West Indies, Mona. Carolyn Cooper is a professor of literary and cultural studies at the University of the West Indies, Mona. She is the author of two influential books on Jamaican popular culture, Noises in the Blood, 1993, and Sound Clash, 2004. She is the editor of Global Reggae, 2013, in collaboration with Professor Hubert Devonish, Dr. Deborah Hickling, and Mr. Michael Holgate. Professor Cooper has drafted a proposal to establish an interdisciplinary, cross-faculty center for the creative industries and cultural enterprise at UWI Mona. A well-known media personality, Carolyn Cooper writes a weekly column for the Sunday Gleaner. Please welcome Professor Cooper.
Thank you very much. I must begin with a disclaimer. I am not an economist. My primary discipline, as you have heard, is literature. I've also been moonlighting in what I call the interdiscipline of cultural studies. My contribution to this afternoon's conversation on creative industries as a factor for economic growth is rooted in literary discourse. Furthermore, I make no attempt to explore the broad terrain of the creative industries. Instead, I focus on a small sample of cultural texts that speak explicitly to the issue of misappropriation of intellectual property in the entertainment industry from an African diasporic perspective. and I dedicate my remarks to Professor Stuart Hall, the Don of Cultural Studies, who, as you know, died today. Now, some of these texts may also be interpreted as an indictment of the creators of intellectual property, who must take some of the blame for the economic exploitation of their work by others. Please, Mr. Selector, it's not time yet. Okay? All right. I'm wasting my time. I have to go rewind. Some of these texts may also be interpreted as an indictment of the creators of intellectual property, who must take some of the blame for the economic exploitation of their work by others. Failure to adequately protect property, whether tangible or not, usually results in theft. So the title of my talk, Stealing the Show, Arts of Deceit in the Entertainment Industry. And I frame my reflections on this vexing subject with a poem by Langston Hughes, one of the leading lights of the Harlem Renaissance. Harlem in the 1920s and 30s was a meeting place of cultures where African Americans, then new Negroes, Africans and West Indians created a wealth of art in a variety of forms. And these were constantly appropriated by voyeuristic white America. Hughes' sardonic poem, Note on Commercial Theater, written in 1940, is a clever artistic statement on intellectual property and the entertainment industry. You have taken my blues and gone. You sing them on Broadway and you sing them in Hollywood Bowl and you mix them up with symphonies and you fix them so they don't sound like me. Yep, you done take my blues and gone. You also took my spirituals and gone. You put me in Macbeth and Carmen Jones and all kinds of swing Mikados and in everything but what's about me. But someday, somebody will stand up and talk about me and write about me, black and beautiful, and sing about me and put on plays about me. I reckon it'll be me myself. Yes, it'll be me. Hughes castigates a generic you for having exploited the communal intellectual property of black America. It is particularly appropriate that he names the blues and spirituals as the exploited forms of cultural expression that have been commercialized in the white American entertainment industry. So-called folk music, which is presumed to have no individual authorship, is universally accepted as non-copyright work. Folk music is communal property, legally exploitable by all without the payment of royalties. Hughes' Note on Commercial Theater is decidedly blue. In fact, the poem can be heard as an expression of the blues aesthetic, a lament in which form perfectly articulates theme. Now, although Langston Hughes does indict white America for its hit-and-run appropriation of black culture, he ends the poem on a wryly optimistic note. The focus of attention shifts from the accusatory second-person you to the affirmative first-person me. The poet asserts the urgent necessity of individual acts of reappropriation that will put back full control of black artistic production into the hands of the creators of the culture. In this context, it is important to note that though folk music is not protected by copyright, an individual's arrangement of folk music which, quote, has involved skill and labor, unquote, is protected. The creators of black culture, both individually and collectively, must take control of the power relations between themselves, the producers, and the often exploitative consumers of their culture in order to earn full economic benefits from their intellectual property. 7 decades later, Langston Hughes' poem still resonates across the African diaspora. The UK-based reggae musician Steel Pulse, you can start warming up now, Mr. Selector, but I'll tell you exactly when. The UK-based reggae musician Steel Pulse tell a familiar tale of misappropriation of black popular music. This is not folk music. It is a product of individual imagination that can be protected by law. In the song Roller Skates from their 1984 album Earth Crisis, Steel Pulse document in vivid images the crookedness of the music business. Okay. Thanks. You can cut now. Out on the corner with my roller skates, having fun, says I'm feeling great. In the dark of the night, street lamps glowing on full blast is my radio. Up comes this guy in his flashy car. In his mouth stuck a big cigar. Needed my help, said he. Lost his way. I never heard a word he said. To find some street, said he wanted instructions. So I turned on the music to point out directions. Guess what? Guy jumped on me, messed up my clothes, smashed and grabbed my radio, calling all detectives. Now, Wikipedia defines the destabilizing action of the criminal in this way. Quote, a smash and grab raid or smash and grab attack, or simply a smash and grab, is a particular form of burglary. The distinctive characteristics of a smash and grab are the elements of speed and surprise. A smash and grab involves smashing a barrier, usually a display window in a shop or a showcase, grabbing valuables, and then making a quick getaway without concern for setting off alarms or creating noise. Smash and grab raids can occur in many scenarios, both in broad daylight and at night, and the perpetrators can range from experienced thieves to impulsive vandals. Typically, display windows and showcases that are in enclosed areas, such as shopping malls and office buildings, are less vulnerable to smash and grab raids than those on open streets, particularly where the streets are poorly lit or unobserved, such as premises in pedestrian subways or unstaffed transport facilities. The greatest cost of smash and grab raids is often replacing the windows, which can sometimes far exceed the cost of the goods that are stolen, unquote. Now, in this instant, it's the barriers of trust that is smashed. An everyday interaction on the streets asking for directions is a subterfuge deployed by the crook to distract the attention of his victim. Assuming the mask of vulnerability, losing his way, the criminal exposes the naivete of the trusting soul who fails to read the obvious signs of deceit, the flashy car and the big cigar. The victim must take some responsibility for being not on guard. In fact, in the moment of relaxation, as he enjoys his music in the company of the girls, his defenses are lowered. The very act of consuming culture seems to produce a high that distorts judgment. The song seems to highlight the unsettling distinction between the pleasure and the business of music. Now, it is true that the joy of creating is an end in itself, as is the pleasure of consumption. But the products of creativity must be protected so that the additional reward of generating material wealth can be enjoyed. The victim's failure to recognize deceit and so take precautionary measures is especially troubling, since he confesses, life without music I can't go, no life without music I can't go. Robbed of his music, the victim becomes inarticulate in grief. The lines are cut short and the thoughts are not completed. Police alert is sounded and the thief is soon located, but the power dynamics are altered. Didn't take long to catch him, parked up car and music blasting. On the sidewalk he was dancing, stealing the show, the people watching. Roller skate gang was hot on his track. Stick him up, mister, give me back my radio. And perhaps there's a pun on tracks as both getaway route and the misappropriated record tracks. By the end of the song, the victim finds his voice and launches a murderous verbal counterattack on the fraudster. Bimmer, murder style. Them have to get a beaten, say them have to get a beaten. Nothing greater, nothing best like the music from my wireless. And the only thing that I detest is a man who steal my wireless. He have to run like a fugitive. He have to run from detective. Samuel Thomas is a thief name. He must lead a life of shame. Some of them call him Uncle Sam. Some of them call him Uncle Tom. Uncle Sam and Uncle Tom, yes, they are the same man. S-A-M means steal away music. T-O-M means tiefer of music. The drum and the bass have to move my waist. The rhythm and skank me have Jaffe Tank. The lyrics and song me have to keep me strong. Samuel Thomas, him have to get vank. Him have to get a beaten. Now, it is instructive that this criminal Samuel Thomas, who steals the radio and the show, is a composite character, a fusion of Uncle Sam and Uncle Tom. These figures take us right back to the African-American context of Langston Hughes' note on commercial theater, a cultural landscape in which, I move too fast, in which Uncle Sam and Uncle Tom are all too familiar threats. Steel Pulse cleverly assert that acts of betrayal can be perpetrated from within the black community as well as by outsiders. And the Uncle Tom stereotype in American folklore represents the oppressed black man who bows and scrapes the massa in order to survive. Steel Pulse's conflation of Uncle Sam and Uncle Tom underscores their collaboration in ripping off black culture. Uncle Tom becomes less of a victim and much more an active agent in the theft of intellectual property. I now turn to the Jamaican context and focus on a classic cultural text, the original Yardie film, The Harder They Come, which constitutes a compelling indictment of the shady operations of the entertainment industry. Released in 1972, the film tells a depressing tale of the record producer's exploitation of naive up-and-coming artists. In a culture of material poverty, where so many disadvantaged youth still see the music business as the quickest route out of the deprivations of the concrete jungle, it is not surprising that the record producer becomes a don who controls the flow of resources into the community. But as Reagan Ivan's tragic story illustrates, resistance to forces of oppression is imprinted in the Jamaican DNA. So Jimmy Cliff, acting out Ivan's rebellion, threatening with chance, the harder they come, the harder they fall. Thanks. And I keep on fighting for the things I want, though I know that when you're dead you can't. But I'd rather be a free man in my grave than living as a puppet or a slave. In this foundational cultural text that tells so much about our inequitable society, trafficking in marijuana becomes an alternative source of income for the reggae singer who is not able to make it legitimately. The criminalization of talent that is not rewarded in legitimate forms of enterprise like the music business seems inevitable. Not surprisingly, the models of criminal behavior that are favored by inner city youth are largely derived from the Hollywood movie industry. The glamorization of gun violence that is now institutionalized in dancehall music clearly has its origins in the fantasy world of film with its idealization of macho masculinity. But we don't talk about the film industry as a source. We just demonize dancehall. So one of my favorites, Ninja Man's, Murder Them. And Ninja Man will tell you that it was watching The Harder They Come that made him have this great desire for the guns. And so it's interesting that our imitation of an American form is then imitated by the dancehall DJs. Hey, you're going to lose the work, you know. All right. Now, it is not only deprived ghetto youth who are caught in Hollywood fantasy. The Jamaican jazz pianist, Monty Alexander, in a rap entitled Cowboys Talk on his 1992 CD Caribbean Circle, nostalgically recalls the cowboy heroes of his childhood, enigmatically linking their demise with the birth of ska. Quote, "When I was a little boy, I remember we used to go to pictures. Some people say movies, and some people down in Jamaica say we're going to the flim show, flim. on a Saturday morning, matinee, and we used to sit there and watch the greatest cowboy stars on the screen. And I mean Roy Rogers and Gene Archer and all them kind of man, them riding upon the horse. But you know what? Them not riding no more. It's like ghost riders in the sky, unquote. Monty Alexander evokes instrumental compositions performed by Don Drummond and the Scatterlights, such as Ringo, Lawless Street, and Scattershot. These names clearly originate in the imitated culture of the Hollywood Western. In conclusion, then, we have come back right where we started with the U.S. entertainment industry and Langston Hughes' blues lament about the taking away of culture. In our case, Jamaicans have taken African-American jazz and R&B, mixed it up with mento, and created ska, which we claim as completely our own. And to return to roller skates, we realized that that song was written before global positioning system, GPS navigation, was widely available in the automobile market. These days, no one would fall for the ploy of Samuel Thomas if he came asking for directions in the dark of the night. One would immediately become suspicious of a seemingly well-to-do stranger roaming in the neighborhood. All the same, digital technologies do create new opportunities for theft and require updated strategies for protecting intellectual property. Threats may come from cyberspace, but the criminal motivation is still old-fashioned, down-to-earth greed. All the same, again and again, the new technologies enable innovative actors to make money out of culture. 4 decades after the release of The Harder They Come, the traditional record producers no longer control the industry. Home studios have multiplied, democratizing the distribution of creativity. More and more, working-class Jamaicans who have been historically marginalized now know their own power. Indeed, brand Jamaica is essentially working-class culture. And if we as a nation are to reap the full benefits of our creative industries, we will have to come to terms with fundamental aspects of our culture, such as our language, the root of consciousness. It is bad enough when we allow others to deceive us and steal our show. The real tragedy is when we deceive ourselves and fail to acknowledge our true identity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Cooper, for combining cultural presentation with intellectual contemplation. All right, we did promise question and answer. Would you join me in giving our head table of presenters a round of applause for their excellent presentations? We started a little late. I must say our presenters, in aggregate, kept to their time limits, but we didn't capture back some of that time that we had lost at the very beginning. So we have a few minutes left for question and answer, as we had promised. And I would just encourage anyone who has a question to be as pointed as possible. Just introduce yourselves, and if you want a particular panel member to answer, we can start the question and answer period. We're going to try keep to the 3 o'clock closing, but in the following Professor Cooper's title, Steal the Show. If we need to steal a couple minutes, I hope we'll be tolerated. Okay, the floor is open. Lady in the yellow. Go to the mic. Carol?
Sorry.
Carol, are you first in line?
Yes, I think I am.
Okay, go ahead.
We are a gracious host, but I'll just lead off if you don't mind. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks to all our panelists. My question really has to do with statistics, the Statin, Ms. Coy, and also to Vanus. We have been quoting the 2005 study quite some time now. It's a little embarrassing that we still quote 2005. And so certainly from the IP office perspective, given the importance, you yourself have said how much importance is placed on this as really the first and only empirical evidence that we have of the contribution of copyright-based industries to our GDP. And so we think we need to move forward in updating the study. Did I hear you correctly, Ms. Coy, that there is the wherewithal for you to assist us in terms of capturing this kind of data, even though you did say there were challenges in terms of not getting certain information from the sector? I think, in my own mind, I do believe that this is changing somewhat, and so I don't think it is as difficult, perhaps even as when Dr. James was doing the study in 2005. And certainly there is no methodology. He did work very closely with Statin. I think there are students in the university who would be very keen and would take up the challenge to address this. Is this something that perhaps you would be willing to consider? And certainly we from the IP office perspective would be more than happy to contribute to this process as well. Bearing in mind that WIPO did fund the last study in 2005, but even WIPO itself will have its own challenges, and we certainly have not been able to source funding for the study, but we are anxious to update that. Can I hear from you how we can get this done from a very practical perspective?
I think that was directed to Ms. Coy.
And Dr. James, if possible.
Okay. Ms. Coy?
Statin is fully funded from the government budget. So the funding would not be there. What Statin would be able to assist if there is funding like it was done the last time, Statin would be able to assist in providing the information. We have done a number of supply and use or IO tables since the last study. We are actually in the process of doing another. So if we might not be able to do a full study that Dr. James did, but we could be able to provide some information. But I think you'd need to come to us and let us sit down and see how we could work through this.
Okay. Free time. No problem, but yeah, and that's yes on all fronts. But I want to emphasize as a response that this is not something that would serve the country's best interest if it's done in a piecemeal way. Statin's heart is good, and Carol's heart is even better than good. But the reality is that what you need for sound policy isn't simply a repeat of the measures of GDP, employment, and trade. We need a more comprehensive thing, as I said, like we did for poverty. And so the country has to understand that it gets far more value for its money, right, when it invests in knowing this industry than in almost any other industry, including tourism. Bear in mind, to end the note, bear in mind how important Jamaica's copyright industries are to tourism itself. So I urge you to urge your ministries and fellow your ministers to put money in Statin, extra money beyond the budget here already. And I speak as a Jamaican, a legitimate Jamaican.
Thank you. Next question.
Actually, it's not a question. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy that you're all here and discussing, and happy for all the presenters. Thank you very much. I just wanted to say that maybe, because I know the point was made, how we do go about getting the information is important. The way, the method, or the process in collecting the information is important, but also it was said that it's difficult for us to speak. I mean, us meaning I'm a music teacher and a performer as well. And I'm thinking that maybe you could get information more readily through associations such as JARIA, that's the Jamaica Reggae Industrial Association, or JAVA, Jamaica Association of Vintage Artists and Affiliates, which the members would speak and the members would have other links rather than having to go to the household, maybe approaching the industry or the participants or the people in the industry through these associations would make the information more readily come or flow to you. Because I think we'd be willing to share everything we have. That's just my perspective on it.
Okay, thank you very much for that input. And we go straight to the next question.
Good evening. Just a quick question to Dr. Cooper. How would you view Paul Robeson in his performance in the film of Showboat when he sang Old Man River? Was that him being Uncle Tom, or was he being true and an African-American groundbreaker, breaking the ceiling of showing a black man in a film made by a white Jewish or composed by white Jewish people?
It's a good thing you have answered your own question.
No, I'm not
because
asking you. I'm asking you.
Let me finish.
I'm
finish because I haven't seen the film, so I can't comment.
Well, you can download it, you know.
Okay, yes, I will.
Just another comment, though. In his presentation this morning, Mr. Hawkins mentioned that we are going through transitions in how we approach things. And he mentioned that we have a situation where we have fixed price, discount, and free. And as you might not know, this is jam down. Everyone, everything for free. So I think our music industry, and I think a lot of the musicians who will probably speak to this very strongly on Wednesday, have realized that one can't fight down the download and the sharing and the burning and the ripping that's going on. What one they have realized is that is a means of getting their music to the public. And how one makes money is by performance and growing your fan base and your Twitter accounts and your Facebook accounts. We are in a different age and a paradigm has shifted dramatically. And we must realize that copyright in Jamaica, we need to copyright different properties and grow those bases of income for ourselves and not stick to the business. But it cuts both ways. Because remember, one of the most prolific composers in Jamaica, when I was a picnic, I used to buy my records at 17, North Parade, at Randy's, was adapted. So if national intellectual property organizations ever seek to recover the copyrights that our Jamaican musicians have been ripping off from others abroad and ripping off young composers and singers, we've been a deeper hole and we might be paying out more than we are getting.
Okay, thank you for that observation. Next question, moving right along. We're going to end in a couple minutes so that we can squeeze in a 10-minute coffee break before the next section. So these are the last two questions.
Okay, good afternoon to everyone. I'd like to thank the panel for such lovely presentations. Directed to Ms. Coy, Carol Coy. You noted in your presentation that services industry accounts for 75%. Am I correct with that figure?
75% of GDP.
Of GDP. But to my knowledge and understanding, to get data, because I've been on the website, and to get data in Jamaica is like hell. The most data you can get is for export and import, agriculture, population. There's nothing, vaguely nothing, in terms of services that is 75% of GDP in Jamaica that you can get readily available. When we, as entrepreneurs, are ready to start businesses, the first thing you go to a bank, they're looking for are asking for this plan. And you cannot get no data to put in terms of projection. How, going forward, Ms. Coy, and SIG, how do we solve this massive gap of data generation, especially for services, which is 75% of GDP?
Ms. Hoy? No, just take the answer quickly. I think we'll cut off after the last lady in the line, and I just ask you again, keep the questions very short and responses also.
Answer? Okay. The first question was about going through Java and the other associations. We tried that, I think, when Dr. James was doing it, and all they had was just a list of their members. There was no information ready that you can use. Because as I mentioned, what we're trying to measure is their output, their costs. But what we can do is go back to them to see if they now have that information. Regarding data, if you go on Statin's website, there's a